Aksys Archive, The Other Side of the Sky, is a spiritual successor to the cult classic Valkyrie Profile. If you're a fan, then you may have already heard of this game, but I found out about it merely by coincidence as I was browsing some recommended games on Amazon. Seeing as it was developed by Tri-Ace, the same developers who made some of my childhood favorite IPs like Star Ocean and Valkyrie Profile, I was optimistic about giving this game a try. If only future me could warn younger, blissful me of the woes that were to come. I was surprised at just how little I enjoyed it. And no, it wasn't because I was optimistic or came in with high expectations. When playing games, I am usually able to find some redeeming quality that is appealing, but with Aksys Archive, I was grasping at straws to find something, anything to make my gameplay experience more pleasant. It was immediately off to a rocky start, with this weird art style and aesthetic looks, with the exception of the animated cutscenes, which were actually drawn quite well. But besides that, nothing about the game was visually appealing. The design of the characters were not interesting at best, and just plain ugly at worst. Kanata, the main character, is the worst offender, with his polka-dotted pants that only slightly passes his knees and his striped socks. The character models also looked very plastic, like dolls, which didn't sit well with me. Typically, I don't expect the best graphics from a game like this, but even with low expectations, I couldn't ignore it. More problems became apparent as I played through the game. In terms of gameplay, it can be best described in one word: repetitive. Oh so repetitive. The game is designed to stretch the little content it had in order to increase replayability and have players spend more time playing. Things such as level design, monster design, and progression mechanics are stretched so thin, there is little substance to be found in this 30-hour game. The biggest chunk of gameplay is spent exploring. A level is selected by picking them from a list on a 2D menu. There is no overworld to explore or a hub to relax in. Gameplay quickly turned into a dull loop of selecting dungeons one after the other without much else to buffer the endless grinding or occasional story progression. It didn't help that the many dungeons in the game used the same small set of environmental textures. I quickly became desensitized to the scenery and the awe of exploring a new world. It started to feel like I was doing work instead of playing a game and having fun. If dungeons were fun to explore, this wouldn't be an issue. Not only was it incredibly boring to see what is basically the same dungeon over and over again, traversing these dungeons felt unrewarding as well. Aksys Archive tries to make dungeon exploration fun by adding interactive skills like double jump or air dashes, among other things that were gradually unlocked through story progression. This opens up more ways to move around a dungeon, so I wasn't just walking around a 2D plane. It sure sounds good, but it didn't translate well into gameplay to make it more enjoyable. Having to stand and wait for these orbs to line up so I can fly through them to reach the next area killed my pacing. I wanted to get through levels as fast as possible without having any speed bumps along the way. If the dungeons weren't so repetitive, then it wouldn't be bad to slow down the pace and take some time to appreciate the environment around me. But this obviously is not the case. On top of that, a majority, if not all the levels, were designed to use these interactive skills, so it was impossible to explore a map completely on the first time through. While backtracking can feel rewarding when used correctly, like in Zelda Ocarina of Time, where you can actually get new useful items or hearts, Aksys Archive's overuse of backtracking through the same levels coupled with the lack of interesting mobility options and unique rewards are enough of a reason to never visit any level more than once. Combat would have been a good way to keep my mind off the repetitive dungeons, since that's pretty much half the game, but combat wasn't that great either, and can even be frustrating at times. It's split into two phases, the attack phase and the defense phase. During the attack phase, AP is spent stringing together attacks to perform combos, or juggling if a launch attack is used. During the defense phase, the player is able to perform guards which can completely nullify damage or counterattack the enemy. Combat is very interactive for a turn-based system, but like the rest of the game, it suffers from being too repetitive. Juggling is supposed to keep combat interesting since it's the most interactive part with good rewards. If an enemy is juggled in the air, the drop rate is increased, whereas if they're hit while downed, more experience is gained. But it was also the most frustrating. Enemies would disappear too quickly after they reach 0 health and touch the ground, so getting an attack in to start or keep the juggling going before they disappeared became annoying. When attacking, a character won't perform their next attack until their first attack is done. Makes sense. But when attacks are queued in the same chain, that can become a bottleneck. Some characters can attack quite slow, while other characters can go through 2 or 3 attacks in a few seconds. If I queue a slow character's attack too quickly, the other characters become blocked off until that second character acts, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Combat flow would feel much better if characters acted independently of each other. Then add in the no AP refund policy on wasted queued attacks, I quickly became irritated because it felt punishing missing my combos. And that's not all. The recycling of the same small set of monsters, which just uses a different color for higher tier enemies, caused combat to get very tiring very quickly. Combat did feel rewarding during the rare times I got decent, usable loot. Greed mode, which is unlocked later in the game, greatly helps with this as it stacks multiple enemy encounters together, increasing the effectiveness of grinding. But that's the problem. It's a grind. Equipment comes with random traits, similar to how Diablo's loot system works. So for instance, the same sword can drop with a randomized trait or no trait at all. I am not a min-maxer, so it doesn't matter to me whether I get the optimal trait for a weapon or not, since it doesn't affect my ability to beat the game. But it was annoying checking my equipment every encounter at the off chance I might have gotten something better. There aren't any cool set bonuses either, so the loot system is just another one of the many shallow ways of extending gameplay. The best strat is just finding the strongest raw weapon and combining it with the best raw trait, whereas if you had set bonuses, there could at least be something more interesting to consider when making builds. That said, character progression is probably the least awful aspect of gameplay, and felt the most rewarding. Each character starts with a class, and has a certain number of abilities they can learn. These include guard and attack skills to help with combat power or combos, and passive skills that are always active, such as increased experience gain. As characters learn more skills and builds become more fleshed out, combat becomes a little more interesting before it once again starts feeling repetitive. One of the cool parts of progression is the ability to potentially transfer a randomly learned skill to another character after combat. But this was implemented because of the sheer amount of skills and classes to be unlocked per character. Like the rest of the game, the progression system is stretched out in an attempt to artificially extend the life of the game. I was able to surpass level 100 after completing the game and was nowhere close to learning all the skills for a class, let alone the skills in the entire game. Like character progression, the soundtrack composed by Motoi Sakuraba is one of the better parts of Aksys Archive, but when compared to his other works like Star Ocean 2 or Valkyrie Profile, Aksys Archive's score is easily forgettable and unimpressive. There are only a small number of good tracks like the title theme or the final boss theme. Meanwhile, a majority of the BGMs didn't improve the gameplay experience or add any extra emotion to the story expositions, which is unfortunate because the story could really use an extra boost. The story itself was pretty linear and there weren't any gripping moments. A simple overview of the story is that it's centered around 12 people who got sent to another world and are now trying to find their way back. While the premise of the story doesn't follow the typical save the world trope, I found it difficult to get invested. After completing the game, there was only a feeling of relief that I was done and no longer had to play. Aksys Archive didn't help form that bond between me and the characters that answers this one important question. Why should I care? There is little meaningful character development in the main game, so the problem the characters had didn't matter to me. A lot of the character development was done through side quests, which is just exploring a dungeon that isn't part of the main story. When exploring, there are crystals that give some backstory on a character when interacted with.
Hey babe, wanna come hang out with us?
But there can also be cutscenes when returning from a completed side quest that expands on the group's relationship as a whole. These are really good reasons to do more side quest related activities under normal circumstances, but it just felt like too much of a pain to go through with it. It's unfortunate since the characters actually seem likable once I got to know them better. I did find out a good amount of information on Kanata, one of the main characters, and I liked the relationship he had with his other close friends. There was actually a funny scene that made me crack a smile. Surprising, I know. The potential is there for that much needed connection to the characters, but if only there were better methods to encourage me to actually do the side content. Needless to say, I knew very little about the other half of the cast. In addition, there are also 2 alternate endings and an extra bonus dungeon with 4th wall breaking content that also seems interesting. But I never went back to complete them since I was completely burnt out at this point.
What?
While Exist Archive can be called a spiritual successor to the cult classic Valkyrie Profile, I'll remember it more as a game that tries and fails to mimic the formula that made Valkyrie Profile so enjoyable. Exist Archive was created with a very low budget, so I guess it's not too surprising the final product turned out the way it did. If Exist Archive accepted the fact that it didn't have a lot of content and instead chose to focus less on the repetitive gameplay loop, there might have been something to be enjoyed. There are rarely any games that I have had to force myself to finish, but Exist Archive is definitely one of the few. I don't typically consider ratings when purchasing a game, after all everything is subjective, but because of this, sometimes I do get what's coming. And that is, sinking time into a game that is not worth playing.